Good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah.
Really nice to be here with all of you. I think this is our first of many joint hearings we will have together between House Ways and Means and Senate Finance. Really glad that we have so many House Ways and Means alums on Senate Finance, because I know we'll be able to trust your work a little better. And I think today we are really just laying the foundation for the work that we're going to need to be doing together over the next few months to do everything we can to strengthen our public education system and the financing that supports it. Should we go around and do some introduction? I'll start. I'm Emily Kornheiser, representative from Brattleboro.
I'm Ann Cummings, Senator from Washington District, and I chair the Finance Committee. And some of us got out of a meeting with the governor 15 minutes ago. So we're eating our lunch. That includes staff.
Go ahead.
Thank you for that. I'm Carol Odie, and I'm a representative from Burlington.
I'm Bridget Burkhart. I'm a representative from South Burlington, representing South Burlington and a little piece of Williston.
Ruth Hardy, I'm a senator from the Addison District.
Martine LaRocque, Senator from Chittenden Central.
Chris Mattos, Senator from Chittenden North District.
Scott Beck, Senator, Caledonia District.
Charlie Kimball, representative from Woodstock.
Rebecca Holcomb, representative from Sharon, Stratford, Norwich, and Thetford.
Marty Feltus, representative from Caledonia 3, which is Linden, Sutton, Wheelock, Sheffield, and Newark.
Jim Maslin, representative from same towns as Rebecca Holcomb.
And I'm Carolyn Brannigan. I represent the towns of Georgia and Fairfax in Fairfield County.
Representative Mark Igley from the Orleans Lamoille District.
Representative Teddy Wazazak, Berry City.
Representative Bill Canfield, representing Fairhaven, West Haven, Benson.
Thanks, Bill. I wonder if the staff would like to introduce.
Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. I handle the education policy matters. I'm Julia Richter. I work for Joint Fiscal Office.
Ezra Holden, Joint Fiscal Office. Hello, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I'll be with you for Ed Finance this year.
Thank you. And so, as I said, we are here to really just lay the groundwork for how, at its most basic, our education finance system works. I know that a lot of people around this table have a quite advanced understanding of that and have spent a lot of time working on it. And I think in order for us to have a shared collaboration going into this biennium, it's going to be really important for us to just start together, learning together. So that's what we're doing today. And with that, if you would like to start us off, that would be wonderful.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
So, chairs, would you like me to dive in?
Dive right on in. If you'd like to share your screen, that would be wonderful. I have no sense of if Sorsha can hear anything that's happening. I trust that she'll. Where's little booth?
Did I just hit okay, Sorsha. Is that? So while I'm sharing my screen, wonderful to see all of you who I know again. For those of you who I don't yet know, we'll be likely seeing a lot of each other. So I look forward to working with all of you. For the record, I am Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. I work on education finance. So I believe that you heard from Chris Roop already today. Also from JFO, we're nonpartisan, non-political. We're really here to make sure that all of you have the information, the analysis, the data that you need to understand what you're trying to understand and make the decisions you're trying to make. So I was asked to come in to present today as sort of a 101 plus 201 of education finance in Vermont. So I will just preface this with there's a lot of words in the slides. I might not read all of them, but I was hoping to put enough context on the slides that if people want to go back and review some of the things that I've talked about, the slides are a resource for you to do that. The table's a little bit bigger than I'm used to. Is this a good volume level for everyone? Okay.
Thanks for asking.
Okay. So, education finance in Vermont. In terms of an outline, I will start big picture in terms of just a general overview of education finance in Vermont. This will seem familiar if you attended the all legislative briefing where we did do a 101 of ed finance in Vermont. And then we'll dive deeper into education expenditures and then further into education finance and education funding. And I do want to include a caveat here that I'm really focusing on state dollars. So I'm focusing on the statewide education fund. There are a lot of federal dollars that flow to education in Vermont, which I'm not touching on here because that's a whole other topic, a whole other testimony. And I will defer to the chairs if you want to do questions throughout. I'm happy with that, or whatever.
Let's try to see how slide questions at the end of each slide go so that you can finish all your sentences. And if we are need to move a little faster, we can pivot to at the end of the presentation.
Okay. So big picture. Vermont, as I'm sure we all know, is different from other states when it comes to education finance. It's a statewide funding formula that's coupled with local property tax administration. There's spending decisions that are made at the federal level, the state level, and the local level that impact Vermont's education finance scheme. So school district spending is determined at the local level in the sense that school districts are building budgets. It's also determined at the state level with state policies that are being set, state decisions that are being set. And of course, there's also federal standards that schools need to comply with. School boards set budgets. These budgets must be approved by voters. We'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but this is really high level. The General Assembly is setting yields and property tax rates annually at the level necessary to ensure that the education fund is fully funded. There's two types of property taxes that we'll talk about, homestead and non-homestead. And lastly, high-level introduction, since the Brigham decision, which I'm not the expert on, I completely defer to my colleagues at Legislative Council. But since the Brigham decision and a number of other acts since then, the homestead property tax rate is a function of district per pupil spending. So it's not a function of district wealth. Tax rates, specifically the homestead tax rate, varies according to per pupil spending by district. We'll talk about all of the nuances there, but high level overview, this is kind of what we're going to be walking through. So before getting into the details, I think it's helpful to set the stage of just in terms of history. I know that John has prepared a presentation about Brigham, so I won't talk too much into it. And I'll leave that for him. But I will say that before 1997, there was an old funding scheme to fund the education system. There were inequities across the state, which led to the Brigham decision and thus the passage of Act 60, which is really famous. And essentially there's a lot of nuances, but wrapping it up into a clean sentence, I guess, a town's property wealth no longer affects its specific education tax rate. So regardless of a district's property wealth, if both districts have the same per pupil spending, which is actually a technical term, they're going to have the same homestead property tax rate. So education finance in Vermont, this is a timeline. I honestly could have chosen any one of these boxes to sort of start the timeline and go through there, right? Because it's a circular process. But I thought it would be helpful to think about the beginning of this timeline of school districts that are beginning to prepare their budget. So this usually happens in the beginning of the fall. right? School districts start to plan their budget, they meet with their team, they figure out what that budget is going to look like. Then leading up to December 1, tax in consultation with the Joint Fiscal Office, we work together to say, okay, given all of the best available information, what is the status of the education fund? We need to follow all of these modeling parameters, which give us the December 1 letter. It technically forecasts rates for the coming fiscal year. But what that means by forecasting is it means that we don't have great data at that time. And there's a lot of decisions that have not been made yet. So it's spelled out in statute, given the best available data, given all these assumptions, here's a forecast so that it's sort of a starting point for people to think through. After the December 1 letter, you all are getting improved data. Meanwhile, school boards are continuing to prepare their budgets. They're going to then warn or let voters know what those budgets look like in preparation for town meeting day. Most school districts have their voters vote on their school district budgets on town meeting day. Not all school districts, but most. Following that, the General Assembly sets the property tax rates at a level and yields at a level necessary to fund the education fund. That's done in the yield bill, which both of your committees will be working on throughout the session. And then the Department of Taxes sets the tax rates, sends those out to towns. Towns administer the property taxes. Taxpayers pay the taxes. School districts are implementing those budgets throughout the entire process. And also year-round, school districts are using state funds to fund their school. Okay. So that's my whirlwind tour through high-level overview of ed finance in Vermont. Moving into education expenditures. So when thinking about education finance in the state, we have to think at both the local level, because there's local school district building their budgets, and also at the state level, because it's a statewide education fund. So starting at the local level, each school district is building an annual budget. This budget requires local voters' approval. And from a general ed finance perspective, we can kind of think of these school district budgets as having two primary parts. There's the offsetting revenues and then everything else. So offsetting revenues is essentially the revenues that are coming into the district, generally either for a specific purpose or because of a specific nuance associated with those revenues. So that includes things like state and federal categorical aid. So that's like special education dollars, or the transportation reimbursement, or flexible pathways dollars. Tuition revenues, so that's if a school district is paying another school district to educate students, that's counting as offsetting revenues. We've got prior year surpluses or deficits or reserves of the school district. So that all fits into the bucket of offsetting revenues. We take the school district budget and we say, okay, after accounting for all of those offsetting revenues, what is left? And what is left is what we call, and this is a technical term, education spending. This is all of the funds that a school district spends net of the offsetting revenues. So then moving up to the state level, right? We've got these school district budgets all across the state, and then we've got the statewide education fund. The statewide education fund is really the aggregated costs of statewide public education for the most part. This includes all school budgets that are funded other than your federal dollars. Again, we can think of two buckets here. We can think of the education payment, which is that, we were just talking about education spending. Education payment is the sum of all education spending in every district, right? So we're calculating the education spending of a district, summing all of that up, and that becomes the education payment. All of the other expenditures are kind of in the other bucket. So that includes categorical aid that's flowing out of the education fund. It also includes one-time appropriations, and it includes other operating and administrative costs at the state level. So going into the education fund outlook. So for those of you who have served on the Ways and Means Committee, Finance Committee, or maybe just are interested in education finance, you've seen this document before. In case you haven't, I've included some screenshots and also sent some materials forward. What this really is you can kind of think of it as an operating statement of the education fund. But for those of you with accounting and business backgrounds, it's a little bit different because it's reflecting things like appropriations, not actual costs. I've included and posted on the committee page under my name is the December 1 letter, Education Fund Outlook, and the annotated guide to reading it. And I see that you all have printouts of that in front of you, which I'm excited to see. I'm going to briefly pivot because this is our first time seeing the Education Fund Outlook to just showing you those two documents. So this is I'm not expecting anybody to be able to read the numbers that I have on the screen behind me. But this is the Education Fund Outlook for the December 1st letter. So this is what, when we're referring to the Education Fund Outlook, this is that document you have in front of you. This is the other document that you have printed out in front of you, which is also, I'm not expecting you to read, but this is the annotated guide of the Ed Fund Outlook. So the idea of this is kind of helping you to understand what each line is capturing. So while line numbers may change and specific lines in there may change, it gives you an idea of what each line is capturing. So coming back to talking about expenditures, we've got expenditures. That's one section of the Education Fund Outlook. And that's talking about all of these appropriations that are being made out of the education fund. So that on the document you have in front of you is lines 11 through 26. Outlined there are the appropriations that are made by fiscal year. So we've got the previous fiscal years, and then we've got projections coming into the coming fiscal year. Over the course of the session, you're going to be seeing a lot of me and my colleague Ezra coming in with the Education Fund Outlook, and it will reflect different policy considerations or ideas that you are asking us to model in the Education Fund Outlook. So you'll see new lines coming in to reflect savings or expenditures that you're asking us to model. I want to highlight here that the education payment, so the sum of that education spending is about 80% of all appropriations from the education fund. So that's the vast bulk of the appropriations are captured in that one line of education payment. And you'll remember that education payment is all education spending. The bulk of education spending or ultimately the education payment are personnel costs. So that's where you're seeing, that's what you're seeing here in line 11. There may be other personnel costs also included in the other line items as well. So that is a high level overview of education expenditures out of the Ed Fund. Moving into funding. So the Ed Fund, again, maintaining that theme of buckets. We can also think of two buckets when it comes to funding of the education fund. So there's two sort of buckets. There's the property tax sources into the education fund and the non-property tax sources into the education fund. This presentation is really focusing on property taxes. I'm not the expert on consumption taxes. That's actually somebody else at JFO, but I will share with you that the education fund has a number of non-property revenue sources flowing into it. So you see that reflected in this gray box in the middle. All of sales and use tax is dedicated to the education fund. There's also a quarter of meals and rooms tax, a third of purchase and use tax, all proceeds from the state lottery. Last year, there was a one-time general fund transfer to the education fund to buy down property tax rates. So that's what you're seeing reflected here in this box. And then there's some other revenue sources that are dedicated to the education fund. So we've got all of those revenue sources coming into the ed fund. And we've got all of these expenditures that the state has guaranteed to fund. So we say, okay, here is how many expenditures we have coming out of the education fund, right? All of that education spending, all of that categorical aid, any other policy choice that the legislature has made specifically of an appropriation, all of those dollars, we're adding them up. We're saying this is how much the education fund is. And then we say, okay, this is how much needs to be paid out of the education fund. How much do we have coming in from those non-property revenue sources? And whatever else is left over that we need to fund, but is not being raised by non-property revenue sources, that's where property taxes come into play. So again, here is in the education fund outlook, this is where you see the different revenues. You can see them in lines 1A through 9. You'll see here that the non-property revenue sources that we were just talking about, that unless another policy decision is made, we can kind of think of those as given. We adopt the economist's revenue forecast, consensus forecast. We say, this is what the economists are telling us is coming into the education fund. And that's reflected here in lines 3 through 8. Our property taxes are being reflected in lines 1A, 1B, and 2. 1B is that property tax credit, which we will talk about in more detail. But that's included in the homestead property tax. So I just alluded to this, but education tax rates are set to keep the education fund fully balanced. The amount to raise statewide from education property tax is determined by taking the total uses and subtracting out the non-property tax revenues. There's 2 property tax bases that are subject to a statewide education tax, and their rates and structure differ. We have the non-homestead property and homestead property. Homestead property is defined in statute, and you can think of that as where somebody lives and all of the surrounding acreage, their principal dwelling, and all of the land surrounding that principal dwelling. Non-homestead is literally everything else that's subject to property. So that includes second homes, it includes apartment buildings, it includes businesses, it includes short-term rentals. That's all non-homestead property. I also want to make a note. I know that we'll be doing a deep dive into the CLA, the common level of appraisal, next week, but I wanted to mention it up front that Vermont, while we have a statewide education fund, we don't have a statewide reappraisal system. And that what that means is that some towns may be appraising right now, while other towns last appraised 10 years ago. And what that means is because they're all subject to the statewide property tax, we need to ensure that they're paying their fair share into the education fund regardless of when they were last appraised. And how do we do that? That's through the CLA. It's used to account for these differing appraisal schedules. And I'm talking about this right up front because when discussing tax rates, we generally use the term equalized to refer to tax rates if the property were to be appraised at fair market value. So assuming that that property is 100%, this is what their tax rate would be. The term actual is to refer to the fact that in reality, we need to adjust tax rates to account for those differing appraisal schedules. So actual is after the CLA is being applied. So everything I'm talking about here In terms of tax rates, I'm talking about equalized, and you'll see that included there. On the education fund outlook, you're seeing equalized tax rates. And it's important to note that equalized is really at 100% of fair market value. So non-homestead property tax. This is tax on all real property that does not qualify as a homestead or is not exempt. There's a full list of exemptions in statute. I knew my slides were already very wordy, so I did not include all of those exemptions here. But there is a statutory definition here for non-homestead property. The equalized, so pre-CLA, non-homestead property tax rate is uniform across all towns. So in the yield bill, you set one rate for pre-CLA for the non-homestead property. Technically, there's a rate in statute, $1.59, but because it's calculated annually to ensure that the ed fund is fully funded, that's annually not withstood in the yield bill. And it's really a policy choice of how much are you going to raise from non-homestead property? How much are you going to raise from homestead property? As well as how much are you going to raise in total? You know, are you going to add more expenses to the education fund? Are you going to take something out? But ultimately, it's a choice of how much you're raising on homestead, how much you're raising on non-homestead. So homestead property tax, this is the tax on homestead properties, the principal dwelling and surrounding land. This is the tax rate in each town that's dependent on that locally approved education spending per pupil. So going back to when we were talking about education spending, we see this number coming back here. So the homestead property tax rate is adjusted to account for per pupil spending. And I want to note that per pupil spending is actually also a technical term, and it includes those pupil weights, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail as well. But before we go into that detail, the homestead property tax rate is $1 per $100 of property value, and then it's adjusted for local per pupil education spending. If a town belongs to more than one school district, then the homestead tax rate is weighted by enrollment in each district. So I have included the equation here. I don't think it's large enough necessarily for the end of the table. But what we're seeing here is this local adjustment. So we've got the property yield, and that's what you all are setting in the yield bill. That's the same across the state. The per pupil education spending is what is being voted on at the local level. And the way that that is calculated is it's taking the education spending and it's dividing the education spending of a school district by the long-term weighted average daily membership, or LTWADM. It's a mouthful, and you can think of it, as those are the weighted pupils, but I wanted to be technically accurate for all of you, so that's why we have those long terms in here. I also want to note that the dollar is a base rate. So that means that a school district's rate, even if they're spending below the property yield, if their per pupil spending is less than the property yield, they're going to still receive a rate of $1. So going a step further into that long-term weighted average daily membership and pupil weights. These were adjusted in Act 127 for those of you who were here then or were following education finance. So the current law pupil weights that I have here reflect the weights that were adjusted in Act 127. They're set in statute, and essentially what they aim to do is to address different student needs or circumstances by giving a school district more tax capacity for those students. So essentially the way that it works is the AOE takes long-term average daily membership. So that's over 2 years, the number of, on average, kids with butts and seats. They add into that state-placed students and other student counts to make sure that they have a good reflection of the number of children in that district or pupils. And then they apply weights to every student in that district if they fall into one of these weighting categories. So a student may fall into every weighting category, in which case they would receive every additional weight. The weighting categories, I don't know if we're going to talk about this. There's going to be a separate presentation likely, but we've got our grade level weights. We've got a weight for students from economically deprived backgrounds. We've got an English learner weight. And then we have a couple of district weights. So we have the sparsity weight, which essentially is if the number of people in a district per square mile falls within certain parameters, every student in that district gets a weight because they're from a sparse district. Finally, we also have a small school weight. This is only applicable for those districts that are considered sparse. So you can't get a small school weight if you're not getting a sparsity weight. But if you qualify for a sparsity weight, you may also get a small school weight. And all the parameters of those weights I've laid out here in this table. So we take the long-term average daily membership. Well, not we. AOE takes the long-term average daily membership. They take all of the weights for all of the students in every district. And then for each district, they add them all together. These weights are additive. And that's how they create the long-term weighted average daily membership of each district. So I've included an example in case that's helpful for people thinking through the actual mechanics of how this works. So this is the same formula that we had 2 slides earlier. But I put some numbers into this per pupil spending and property yield in order for you to think through that proportional adjustment to a tax rate. So in fiscal year 2025, the property yield was 9,893. You also will see that on your education fund outlook. In the top for FY25, you can see that yield number. But if districts spent up to that amount, they would have an equalized tax rate of $1. So a district with a per pupil spending of $9,893, they would have a tax rate of $1. A district spending $8,000 per pupil, per weighted pupil, would also have a tax rate of $1. If a district is spending more per weighted pupil than that yield amount, their tax rate is going to be adjusted with this local adjustment. So the example I had here is if a district is spending $14,839 per weighted pupil, which is 150% of that yield, then that district would have an equalized rate of $1.50 because they're spending 150% of the yield. And I do want to note that this is assuming that they're not receiving a tax rate discount that you all passed last year in Act 484, which we don't need to talk about right here unless that's helpful. But assuming they're not receiving any discounts or anything special going on in the background, they'd have an equalized rate of $1.50. Moving on from that local adjustment of the property tax credit of the homestead property tax, we're moving into the property tax credit. So this is that income sensitivity portion of the homestead property tax. People often talk about, folks paying on property, paying on income. This is what they're talking about. Vermont's homestead property tax has this credit based on income. Traditionally, about 70% of Vermont households have received a property tax credit based on their income. That's been decreasing over time. I'll go into a deeper dive into income sensitivity next week. But essentially what this does is when all is said and done, a person may, or a household may be paying on the value of their property or the value of their income. This credit is applied to the following year's tax bills, and it's limited by the taxpayer's income. High level, there's sort of 4 different brackets of household income to keep in mind when thinking about the property tax credit. For households with a household income less than 47,000, they're subject to something called a circuit breaker. We will talk about that. Household income up to 90,000, the property tax credit may be used on the first 400,000 of the equalized house site value. And then households above 90,000 may use it on the first 225,000 of their equalized house site value. There's also that top piece, that 115,000 that I've got here. And this is not included in statute. This is a mathematical exercise that JFO in consensus with the tax department do annually to see where's the break-even point. At what point would a household never qualify for the property tax credit because their income is too high? And this year that's 115,000. So that changes annually based off of the relations of the yields. I also want to note that household income is a specific definition and a specific way of calculating income for the property tax credit. So the intuition of that is there are some exemptions, but in general, it's all of the income earned by everybody living in that homestead. You add up. So my husband and I, we add my income, we add his income, anything else that we're getting in terms of income, that's our household income. And that's specific for the property tax credit calculation. The way that the property tax credit is calculated, we require another yield. So we have the property yield that we just spoke about. There's also an income yield. This is also going to be set in the yield bill. The intuition, the way of thinking about the income yield, is the same intuition as the homestead property yield. And I think this is an important nuance that sometimes is overlooked, is regardless if a homestead qualifies for a property tax credit or not, their liability is going to be impacted by the local per pupil spending. So property tax credits are also reflective of that local per pupil spending. So that means that the income tax rate, as you can see, just the intuition of the formula, the income tax rate is also going to be reflected or reflecting the per pupil education spending. So again, it's essentially the same example, just with different numbers here for the income rate. But in FY25, the income yield was 10,110, which means that any school district with that per weighted pupil spending amount up to that income yield would have an income rate for the purpose of calculating the property tax credit of 2%. If districts are spending more than that income yield, they will have a proportional income rate, just like the homestead property tax rate. So here it's the same thing. If a district's per weighted pupil spending amount is 150% of the income yield, then the homestead income tax rate will be 3%. So we're calculating these homestead property tax rates. We're calculating these income property tax rates or income education tax rates. But then there's a further piece of the puzzle here when thinking about income sensitivity, and that's for those households with incomes less than 47,000. So if the household income is below 47,000, then they're entitled to a further tax credit. And the way of thinking about that is saying, based off of the household income, this household cannot pay more than a certain percentage of their income on property taxes. It is often referred to as the circuit breaker. And there's actually two pieces of this. There's the statewide education tax circuit breaker, which you see reflected in this left table. And then there's the municipal property tax circuit breaker. The statewide education tax circuit breaker is covered by the statewide education fund, and the municipal property tax circuit breaker is covered by the general fund. And these two are also credits, right? So this is reflected on the following year's tax bill as a credit back. So there's a lag that we will be talking about throughout the session. But what does that actually mean, right? We've calculated the homestead property tax, we've calculated the income tax, we've talked about the circuit breaker, but how does that actually end up on somebody's tax bill? How do we determine somebody's overall property tax liability? We need to think about all of those different aspects. So first, we need to think about their household income, right? 47,000 to 90,000, and then up to whatever that break-even point, which this year is 115,000. And then dependent on their house site value equalized, we have a further step. So we're calculating essentially how much would they pay on property, how much would they pay on income, and if they would pay more on property than they would on income, the state credits them the difference. In reality, what this means is this calculation where we're calculating how much a homestead would pay on property and how much a homestead would pay on income and the difference, and if that household is subject to a credit, is happening after all of the yields and the income has been filed and we have all of the information, which introduces this lag where the credit then appears on the following year's tax bill. So what did you pay? What would you have paid? And if you would have paid less on income, it's credited on the following year's bill. And that's all I had prepared for you today. I do have a few resources here at the end, high-level resources, and I'm sure we can help you find other resources if you're looking for anything else.
Anyone have any questions? Okay. Let's stand up and stretch while John comes and sits down. Or stay in your seat, whatever I want to stand. You can do whatever you want.
Sounds good.
There is, we have to yield though.
It's really a test. The test says if you know what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Make sure I understand the way it's.
Yes.
But never, and last year, the same thing.
James. Sure. Go ahead.
Right, so
Is it the 130? I can tell you what.
it's true. Yes, and so this coming year, it will be 115.
Unless we end the session with a feel that is higher. Yes, it always starts. And the view of that, like, rate. So this is not necessarily, because if it goes to the your district.
John Gray, he's a new attorney.
I can't believe before.
Yeah, so it's reflective of the relationship.
Yeah.
And that the other.
We're gonna have John sit down.
Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry. Those are for you.
Clarifying, sorry.
If there was a shift in ownership.
We're gonna get restarted. There were time, I love that no one wanted to ask questions in the big group. It's so respectful of everyone else's time. We're gonna get started again.
There's this much deltas in the race.
They haven't switched yet, it's a random number generator that's involved.
So everyone gets together, pulls numbers out of it.
John, hi. Thank you so much. I think you're new to a lot of us
Yes.
as a member of Legislative Council. You've been on Legislative Council
Yes.
for a little while. So do you want to introduce yourself and we'll all introduce ourselves?
So hi, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. Some of you know me, but most of you I have not worked with. For those who have worked on these issues in years past, I wanted to stress that my position covering education finance is a new position that our office created. It is boosting our capacity to handle this high demand topic. We still have Beth, who introduced herself earlier today, and Kirby, who's not in the room, but our tax lawyer. I joined our office last year. I covered housing, and you may recall the big data privacy bill. I worked on that last year and then transitioned to this year. Originally from the South, but I am super happy to be here and I am excited to jump into this with you guys.
Thank you. Do we all want to do another quick round of introductions? Scott, you can get us started.
Back to St. Johnsburg.
Chris Manos melted.
Hi, John Martine.
Hi, John. Ruth Hardy. Hi, Bridget Burkhart, South Burlington.
Carol Odie, Burlington representative.
Randy Brock, Franklin County and Alpha.
They're coming to you probably now. Representative.
Representative Bill Canfield.
Rep. Teddy Wazazak, Berry City.
Representative Mark Higley Lowell.
Representative Carolyn Brannigan from Franklin County.
Representative Jim Maslin, Deptford, Sharon, Stratford, and Norwich.
Marty Feltus from Linden.
Becca Holcomb, same towns as Jim.
Charlie Kimball from Woodstock.
Thank you guys. Yeah.
Where are you from in the South?
I'm from Georgia,
Okay.
middle Georgia. So if you know where Macon is, I'm just south of there.
Okay. Good.
It is always hard to, can you guys see this and hear me?
Yes.
I can zoom in a little bit. Maybe I can. Yeah. It's always hard to follow Julia. The advantage that I have is that my presentation is super brief. So Brigham, we're going to talk about Brigham. So this is the foundational case in the education finance sphere. This is the legal reason that we talk so much about equity in this area. You may have political, ethical reasons that you talk about equity, but for legal reasons, why so much of the conversation in this space is about equity is because of this case, Brigham. So what is Brigham? This is a 1997 case where a set of different plaintiffs brought suit. So this was students in property poor districts. This was taxpayers in property poor districts and school districts that themselves were property poor, arguing that the then current foundation plan, which was the existing plan at that time, violated the Vermont Constitution by creating inequities between property rich and property poor towns. Basically, what they're saying is that those folks who were living in your property poor districts weren't afforded the same educational opportunities that students in wealthier districts had. So that's what the plaintiffs, that's the claims that they brought to the Vermont Supreme Court. What did the Supreme Court say? They said the education financing system in place with its substantial dependence on local property taxes and resultant wide disparities in revenues available to local school districts deprive children of an equal educational opportunity in violation of both the Education Clause and the Common Benefits Clause of the Vermont Constitution, which I'll come to those two in a second, but that's sort of the big thing about this case. The Supreme Court saying the existing plan at that time, which we called the Foundation Plan in accordance with Act 84, which is what first introduced that to Vermont, was defective for these reasons. And Julie was really helpful in flagging, calling out statewide dollars. And the reason that she did that, at least from my perspective, is that it contrasts with the program that was in place at that time, which was so dependent on local property taxes. So what does the state have to do under this case? What did the Supreme Court definitively say the state has to do? It must ensure substantial equality of educational opportunity throughout Vermont. It's key that it says that the Supreme Court has said the state must ensure this. The towns and the school districts are not the ones on the hook for this. It's the state that's on the hook for it. This doesn't mean that the state can't use the towns as the means for achieving that, but the state is ultimately the entity that's on the hook. And then super important to note for you guys' purposes, the Vermont Constitution is silent as to how this obligation must be funded. Although the legislature should act under the Vermont Constitution to make educational opportunity available on substantially equal terms, the specific means of discharging that broadly defined duty is properly left to its discretion. So the court did not go out of its way to say how to do this. It didn't take any stance on how this is to be achieved. It just said that the legislature needs to come up with a way for this to happen. So that's why you guys are here today working on this still. So what were the two clauses that we talked about that the Supreme Court relied on to make this ruling? We have the education clause and we have our common benefits clause. I don't think I need to dive into the actual language here, but it's key to note that the education clause is the clause in Vermont's Constitution. It's the only case in which Vermont's Constitution enshrines as a constitutional duty a particular governmental service. So education is different than like police services, fire departments, and the like. Education is recognized as a special right. The Vermont Constitution recognizes a fundamental right to education, and that's one of the holdings that Brigham made. The second piece of this is the Common Benefits Clause, which you can think of as sort of like an anti-discrimination or equal guarantee kind of principle. It's like the Equal Protection Clause under the federal Constitution. And when you think about these together, not only is there a right to education, there's a right to equal educational opportunity. That's what the court is getting at in Brigham. Put quite simply, I will say that the case itself has complexities that we won't dive in today, and it's quite fact specific, but that's the basics of this case. So let's jump to the actual plan that was in place at that time. What did the Supreme Court strike down at that time? Vermont had what they called a foundation plan. I want to call out foundation is used in different senses. Many states have foundation programs. When we reference the foundation plan here, we're talking about the specific plan that Vermont had at that time. So under Vermont's education finance system, the state set a foundation rate annually, which was meant to be a reasonable rate of local property taxation to raise. So they set a foundation rate, and they also set a foundation cost. So they set two things. The foundation cost is an amount needed to provide a minimum quality education. And then what the state did to provide aid is the state provided a grant to cover the gap between that foundation rate, whatever the local could raise at that foundation rate, up to the foundation cost. So here's an example. We have a foundation amount of $5,000 per student. Let's say that the foundation rate is set at 1%. If you have a town grand list of 400,000, so they're able to support per pupil $400,000 in property value, you apply a 1% base rate to that. For that town, they're going to raise $4,000 at that foundation rate amount. And because the foundation cost is set at $5,000, you have a $1,000 gap between those two. The state supplies the aid to fill that gap. So that sounds all nice and dandy, but then we look to a comparison between different kinds of districts. So imagine a town that has lots of property wealth and one that doesn't have so much. In both cases, the town wants to spend $10,000 per pupil. Same situation as before. State has designated a foundation cost or amount of $5,000, base tax rate of 1%. In your property poor, and you can see this on the left side, in your property poor town, we've just walked through how at that 1% value, they're able to raise $4,000. So they receive $1,000 in state aid up to that foundation amount, the minimally adequate amount. And at that same rate applied to a wealthy district, so a property rich town with $1 million in grand list value, they're able to raise $10,000 outright just using the foundation rate. So we see this $5,000 gap between what they're able to raise at the same foundation rate. So if that 400,000, if the relatively poor property town wants to raise the same amount, they have to boost their taxes by an additional 1.25%. And you can see here on the right side that the property poor town has to apply a 2.25% tax rate to get the same amount available to its students as the property rich town have to. So this was.
I just want to add a caveat that it might go without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. this was the foundation plan that Vermont had in place pre-Brigham. This is not definitionally what a foundation plan looks like. There are dozens of ways to create a foundation that are vastly different than this particular way Vermont did pre-Brigham. Thank you. Continue.
No, I mean, that's exactly right. And the reason that we talk about it in this case is because it's conceptually a foundation plan. Literally in Act 84, it calls out foundation plan as the name of the thing. So whenever we're talking about it in the context of Brigham, we're talking about a discrete, specific example of education financing. And that system is what the court ultimately struck down. But the court didn't supply, principles that the legislature should follow in looking through this. It just held out this directive that the state should ensure substantial equality of educational opportunity. And that's what you guys are left to figure out. As we dive into this topic in upcoming weeks, I'm sure we're going to touch on this a lot more, but we can talk about the facts of the case to try to draw out what kind of principles might help guide things here. But it's fairly limited textually what we can say definitively. We don't know today what a Supreme Court would say if we did a different kind of plan. So that's where we are now.
Yeah.
What did we do before 1988?
That I don't know. Yeah.
We had the Miller plan, but I don't know exactly what it was, but.
I think there is someone over. Yeah, Representative.
Thank you. Does the Supreme Court talk about outcomes for students in that decision?
So the focus is on educational opportunity rather than outcomes. The sense in which the court attempts to get at this is what sorts of things the state would be able to control, given that the state is meant to have this obligation to ensure it. And what the court is careful to note is that dollars are something that can fairly safely be said to affect educational opportunity. And in fact, in the pleadings, the state stipulated that there were unequal educational opportunities as a result of this. So the court recognized that there was a direct or quite clear connection between wealth and what was being spent on pupils, and then said the state can have an effect on how dollars are raised and spent. And so that's part of why the big focus is on dollars and opportunity, but it doesn't talk specifically about ensuring any particular outcome. It's about ensuring substantial equality of educational opportunities, the key phrase that you're going to hear me say over and over again.
Thank you, because I thought that was the case. And I try also to talk about equal educational opportunity. It's not about outcomes.
Representative Wasserman?
The substantial equality, is that is that defined somewhere, or is that left to the legislature to interpret?
It's an experiment. You guys I say you have to figure it out. I mean, the way that this ultimately works is make a good faith effort to craft a system that solves this, but we won't know. We won't know until it's challenged, and it's going to be fact dependent at the time that a challenge is brought, if it's brought. But we don't know what substantial equality means.
Anyone else?
I assume we're just talking about what is right now.
We are just talking about what is. It's good to start with what is before we go to what could be or would be. I guess one question for you is, we were having sort of a theoretical conversation about just even the idea of the fact that people use the term Brigham compliant and how that's sort of a weird way to talk about the law. Can you opine on that?
Yeah, I will try to. So it maybe goes back to how I was trying to draw out how limited the advice you can take from this is. All that we know from this case is that the Supreme Court struck down a particular financing system. We don't know a set of a bunch of principles that should be followed as a result of it. We have this directive to follow. So when we talk about Brigham compliant, I think it's easy for the conversation to become skewed because we start thinking about where things stand relative to the system today. And when I started my presentation by talking so much about how this is a conversation of equity, when people talk about Brigham compliance and they're trying to talk about new ideas or new programs that they might bring, inevitably, the comparison that's brought up is between the new proposal and the existing system. The Brigham case isn't about the existing system. The Brigham case is about the system that was in place at that time. So I think sometimes it skews the conversation. It's useful to talk about. Obviously, we need to work through this and think about if the legislature is adequately tackling the requirement to ensure substantial quality of educational opportunity. But if you treat the current system as the pole, and in that way, things start to look less equitable relative to the current system, you start raising up people's concerns about Brigham compliance, when just asserting that a new proposal might be less equitable or different than the current system doesn't necessarily mean that it wouldn't satisfy the court's directives in Brigham. Does that make sense? I realize I forgot about it.
Yeah.
Is it safe to say that if a system was devised that would basically result in unequal educational opportunity based on a community's property wealth or income wealth, then that would not be Brigham compliant?
I don't know that it's quite as clear as that. I think, right, it would be fact specific when a particular case is brought. And so the reason I caution it just throwing out a particular example, if what emerged was a trend of wild disparities in fundraising for students, and I mean that generally not in the two words fundraising, not one word fundraising. If you resulted in a pattern of like wild disparities, that would raise concerns about Brigham compliance. But the pure fact of differences in raising funds or differences in education spending alone does not mean something doesn't satisfy Brigham. In fact, the court in Brigham is careful to say that school districts can spend different amounts. And I would note that in that context, it's not just that they recognized that you would have different weighted pupils, and so you would be spending different amounts per pupil. They recognized that a district might elect to spend more on education as a whole. But you could theoretically have a situation where, like I said, if you had trends where there were wild disparities in raising, you would then ask the question, does this satisfy Brigham?
Anyone else? Did I miss any pieces of testimony that we had scheduled for today? Anyone here was planning to testify that I forgot about? Okay, great. Don't have my agenda. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and your thought with this, and looking forward to spending a wild biennium with you.
It's going to be fun. Yeah.
And thanks everyone for a lovely joint hearing. I imagine at the next one, there will be more conversation and questions, and we'll be getting further into the meat of the matter. So thanks all. Thank you. Ways and Means, we are done for the day, but you have an email with like 20 reports.